Okay, so we're looking at the book of Numbers, and it's our last session, so I thought it might be handy just to finish roughly where we started, seeing where this section that we're looking at fits into the big picture of Numbers. So that is a kind of a rough outline of the whole book of Numbers, and we're in that last section, chapters 26 down to 36. And the whole focus of that section is entirely forward-looking. Numbers obviously sits in between Exodus, the people have left Egypt, and Joshua when they enter the Promised Land and conquer the Promised Land. So this is these years between those two things. You leave Sinai as the first census to count the number of people. Then you have arriving at Canaan, the 12 spies go in, the disobedience. As a consequence, the 40 years in the wilderness, or 38 years in the wilderness, the sequence of Balaam that we looked at earlier, and then now this last section is all about looking forwards. In some ways, you hear people say, don't count your chickens before they've hatched, and this section runs entirely contrary to that advice. The whole of this section, from chapters 26 to 36, appears to treat the conquest of the Promised Land as if it is a foregone conclusion. There's no doubt about the fact it will happen. They just explain what is going to happen. God has promised the people the land. And so this section is effectively all about preparations for inhabiting it and kind of describing what life is going to be like living in the land under God. So again, remembering this is all written to people who have spent decades grown up living in the wilderness, paying effectively for the sins of their parents in that sense, and now are going to be living in the land. So that section, 26 to 36, as you break it down, it starts off with the second census in chapter 26. Again, specifically looking at men of fighting age. That's what Moses is told to take a census of, men of fighting age. This time it does it with the people camped opposite Jericho, ready to go in and conquer the land. Now, the next section you have two blocks, so chapters 26 and 36, which is this story that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the daughters of Zelophehad, and they bookend the remainder of this section. And these women exemplify that forward-looking attitude which assumes the conquest is inevitable. To preserve the name of their father, they want their share of the land, a land which hasn't even been conquered yet, but they want the share for their family. And you have that story starting in chapter 27, and the writer of the book of Numbers has kind of carefully put together the stories such that the outcome of that events of chapter 27 isn't recorded straight away in chapter 28. It comes in chapter 36. So it sort of wraps around this whole section. And then last week you have these chapters 28 and 29 looking at festivals and offerings, and then 30 about vows. Now there's some fascinating stuff in all these sections. That same idea of what is it going to be like following this God in the land. So you have that brilliant section with the daughters of Zelophehad, and there's no indication that Mount Sinai was God offering his first draft, looking for feedback. But these daughters say, actually, we've got a request here for an amendment to the law, something different. And not only is their request accepted, but then God codifies their change as law, which then stands for everyone moving afterwards. And then you get the contrast of those chapters 28, 29, 30. You have chapter 30 talking about the importance of fulfilling a vow, how important it is to fulfill your vows, and then promptly gives a whole sequence of scenarios in which God says that this person is no longer required to fulfill their vow. And even though chapter 30 follows hot on the heels of 28 and 29, which are two chapters of festivals and sacrifices, there's no sacrifice at all required to be released from your vows in chapter 30. Just a promise that God will release the woman in that context and a guarantee that he'll forgive her without any forgiveness, without offering any sacrifice at all in that chapter. There's some remarkable events in those chapters, which all is that same idea of how are these chapters building up and helping people to understand this is what life is going to be like, living under God. That following God, God is not an unkind and inapproachable God. God is already being revealed for us in this section as a God of grace and compassion. In the section, bridging chapter between last week and this week's message, chapter 31, this is all about the war on Midian, essentially a foretaste of the conquest that's going to come afterwards. And then our section for tonight are these chapters here, 32 down to 35. So chapter 32 is about two tribes who want to settle on the east of the River Jordan, rather than entering the promised land itself, which is on the west of the River Jordan. Chapter 33 starts with a long list of place names, which recount the whole journey up to this point, and it then ends with a requirement to drive out all the current inhabitants of the land. The people of Israel are due to inherit the land and need to remove the people who are there. And that will be a key passage because, in a sense, it's the failure to fulfill that command and that instruction that brings about all the problems we then come to in the book of Judges. Chapter 34 describes the boundaries of the land that God's given them and lists out some names of tribal chiefs who will then take responsibility for dividing up the land. And then chapter 35 describes the cities that are going to be allocated to the Levites and the cities of refuge. Now, we've got 4 chapters tonight, so we're not going to cover everything there. And even if we did, there are far too many names in chapter 33 for me to try and read them, and 34, so I won't be attempting any of that. However, if what I share starts to feel a little bit like a series of short messages rather than one long one, you aren't mistaken, because that's basically what this is. However, I thought it might be helpful just to put into context the things that we're looking at, simply to explain how, as we move through the chapters, they fit into the big picture. And the big picture for this whole section, from chapters 26 through to 36, the 3 messages we've heard 2 weeks ago, this week and this week, is this whole idea of people are about to enter the land. They're about to move into a whole new phase of life. The years in the wilderness that they've grown up in, this is all going to change. And there will be hard times ahead trying to conquer the land, but the conquest is it's treated as a foregone conclusion. And also trying to think, what is it going to be like living under God? And they've lived under God through his provision in the wilderness, but essentially spent 40 years waiting to enter the land because of the sins of the generation before them. So what is it going to be like living under a God who would do that, who would punish you would suffer the consequences of the sin of your parents, but God provides for you daily through manna and all these different things. So what's it like to live under this God? And all these chapters are taking in that kind of idea. What's it going to be like living in the land, taking possession of the land, living there, serving the God who's brought us through up to this point. So we'll start in chapter 32. Now, the context of 32 is this. All these people are now standing, looking at the promised land, waiting to enter. You have this census has taken place. Moses knows the size of the army that he has available to him. And 2 of the tribes, Reuben and Gad, they look at the land on the east of the River Jordan and think, this is pretty good. This is good land for livestock, and we have lots of livestock. And they decide, actually, they would like their inheritance to be over on the east of River Jordan, and not on the west, where they're going to. Now, Moses doesn't take this well. So there's a few verses here in chapter 32, verses 6 to 9. But Moses said to the people of Gad and to the people of Reuben, "Shall your brothers go to the war while you sit here? Why will you discourage the heart of the people of Israel from going over into the land that the Lord has given them? Your fathers did this when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. When they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw that land, they discouraged the heart of the people of Israel from going into the land that the Lord had given them." And he continues on in the same vein. So when Moses hears what they say, we want our possession to be this side of the Jordan. We want our inheritance to be here. He has some real fears about this situation. And it's not hard to imagine what is going through Moses' mind. Remember, there's only a handful of people, Moses at this point, Joshua, Caleb, who were there as adults at Kadesh Barnea. That's the place the people were camped. When they sent the spies into the land, they came back, the 10 came back fearful and afraid and saying, this is terrible. And the people refused to enter. And the years they've spent in the wilderness is because of the rebellion of those people 40 years ago. And now Moses hears these 2 tribes saying, yeah, we don't want to enter the land. We'd like our inheritance to be over here, please. And you can almost sort of feel the wheels turning in Moses' mind. He's seeing history repeat itself. They spent 40 years in the wilderness because of a refusal to enter the land all those years before. And right now it must feel to him like they're back where they started. 2 tribes don't want to enter the land. And Moses really starts saying, yeah, this is terrible. Why are you saying this? This is awful. And you have these statements you have here. So how to resolve this problem? And this is the kind of beauty of chapter 32. The Reubenites and the Gadites come back to Moses with a proposal. So here, down to verse 16. They came near to him and said, "We will build sheepfolds here for our livestock and cities for our little ones. But we will take up arms, ready to go before the people of Israel, until we have brought them to their place. And our little ones shall live in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until each of the people of Israel has gained his inheritance." I just think that reading this chapter, I think there's something really instructive here about how to deal with conflict. Because you look at what the representatives of Reuben and Gad do not do. They've made their petition to Moses. We want our land to be here over on this side of the river. Moses explodes and says, "This is terrible. History is repeating itself. Your forefathers rebelled. We have suffered as a consequence, and now you're rebelling too." They do not argue that Moses is wrong. They don't go to Moses and say, "No, you misunderstood, you got it all wrong, this is not it." Nor do they refuse to go. They could just say, "Look, this is our land, this is what we want, we're staying here, you head off and have fun." They do not refuse to go either. So what do? Firstly, verse 16, they come near to Moses. Now, I don't think this is just a description of their kind of physical movements, if they kind of wandered up to Moses and say, "Hey, Moses, got time for a chat so we can talk this through." I think this idea, coming near to Moses, coming near to him, is about drawing near to Moses emotionally as well as physically. I think they probably understand that for Moses, the past is painful. What has gone before has left scars. Moses has experienced all the things he has experienced, and he can see things coming back again and repeating themselves. You can't just ignore what happened years ago and act like it never took place, and act like it doesn't matter. It does matter. What happened 40 years back shapes Moses' thinking and shapes Moses' reaction. And so there's a sense in which before they can share the ideas they have, before they can present to Moses their proposal, they need to draw near to Moses. And I think this is more about the way in which they're doing what they're doing. You can kind of almost imagine the way they come close to Moses. This isn't with a kind of body language that is of any kind of threatening posture. This is a movement of friendship, of companionship. They don't work through intermediaries presenting their message to Moses. They draw near to Moses, I think both physically and emotionally. And they try to show as they speak, they have listened to Moses' fears and understand what he's trying to say. And when they speak, they kind of understand and respect Moses' position. And then rather than trying to say to Moses, "Look, you're wrong, that's not what's happening here," rather than talking about conditions and counter offers and presenting things, they offer a solution which in a sense probably went beyond what Moses had anticipated, what Moses thought he was asking and saying. Because they say, "We will send our fighting men, we'll build fortified cities and so on, so that our livestock and our families can stay here. Our fighting men will go with you." And look at verse 17. They will go before the army. They'll go before the army. That is to say, we're volunteering our soldiers to form the vanguard of the army. They will go into battle first. They will face the enemy when they are freshest and strongest. They will go ahead of the army. We'll put our troops in, and not just kind of to make up the numbers. We will put our troops in the front line right at the beginning, at the vanguard of the whole army. So that is to say, what are they saying to Moses? They're saying, not only will we allay your fears about abandoning the people and refusing to obey God, actually we will respond by making your task easier than you had expected. And who wants to be the first one into battle? We will volunteer to go ahead of the army to be those people. And so that's how they approach this whole situation. They draw close to Moses. They show they have understood Moses' fears. They recognize the validity of what's gone on before and the fact that Moses responds as he does. And they present their argument to Moses. It's okay, we'll leave our families safe here and then we will go and fight. And not just fight, we'll form the vanguard of the army. And that just seems a fantastic example for us to, as imperfect and limited humans, we sometimes end up in situations of conflict and misunderstanding. And sometimes those conflicts aren't just based on the question at hand at this point in time. Sometimes it's the things that we carry from the past that shape and mold and create the conflict we're experiencing now. there can be painful layers of past history, sometimes caused by the same family as you have here. It's a kind of almost a family. I know it's an entire nation, but it's a family dispute. It's people that have hurt us, people that we've hurt, times that we've suffered or struggled, and life leaves its scars on our minds and our hearts. And in moments of conflict like this, imitating these tribes can be helpful, recognizing that the past does leave scars. The past does shape our present. It shapes the way we think now. The things that have happened to us, the things that we've suffered, things that have been done to us, mistakes that have been made, things that others have done, that shapes how we respond to challenges in the present. And when these kind of conflicts happen, part of the solution is to really listen, not to argue or escalate the situation, but to draw near. As these tribes, they draw near to Moses, to draw near to people, show that we understand, and understand why they might be doing or saying what they're saying, because the way the past affects their present. And offer trust. I mean, that is effectively what the Reubenites and Gadites are offering. They're saying to Moses, look, you can trust us. We know you've been let down in the past. We know you've suffered in the past. We understand that, but you can trust us now. What we are offering you is trust. And that's how the conflict is resolved in this chapter, not through argument or logic or debate. The conflict is solved through understanding and through trust. And in the end, Moses accepts their proposition. And that appears to be what happens. These tribes leave their families, leave their livestock, send their fighting men in, and take up their position at the front of the army. But it's that willingness to understand that what has happened to Moses shapes the way he responds in the present. Now, as you move into chapter 33, that whole idea that the past is shaping the present is again seen, but now in a different way. So chapter 33 starts. It begins with a review of all the places that Israel has camped during these 38 years in the wilderness. Now, it's a long section which I'm not going to read. If you skim it, you'll see why, because basically it's just a travelogue. It's a long list, essentially, of the names of different places. Now, there are some verses that should grab our attention. For example, why does Moses even have this list? Well, he tells us at the start of chapter 33, verse 2, Moses wrote down the starting places, stage by stage, by command of the Lord. And these are their stages according to the starting places. So why have you even got this list here in chapter 33? Why does Moses have a list of all the places that they've stayed in? It's not that Moses likes keeping lists. It's that God told him to do it. God told Moses to maintain a record of all the places that they had stayed, all the places they had camped. Seems like now and again God himself likes a good list. Now, the result might, at first glance, if you read it through, appear to be one of the most boring books in the Old Testament, if not the Bible. It is basically a list of places. But again, remember that this is a chapter written to a people who are on the verge of invading a promised land. And a people who have spent 40 years living in the wilderness. We may know nothing about many of the places in this list, but for them, you would imagine that many of these places would be names that prompt memories, names that bring things to mind, events that have happened in their past. And as you look at the places on the list, there are essentially three things that you, as we look at it, three types of places that are recorded on this list. Firstly, that there are places that would have reminded them of God's provision and God's faithfulness. So verse 9, and they set out from Marah and came to Elim. At Elim, there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there. And Exodus describes that situation. So you have places in this list which would have brought back to mind for them experiences of God's provision and care and faithfulness to them. You would also have places on this list, so far as the biblical record goes, which are just bog standard. There are places that are of no significance whatsoever in terms of the biblical record. There are places that we don't even know where they are. We know nothing about these places. If you want to try and plot on a map the route that Israel took, you will find lots of examples of maps, usually with lots of question marks on, because no one really knows where half these places are. And thirdly, you'll find places on this list which would have been for them places of just embarrassment, reminders of past failure, So Rephidim, verse 14, and they set out from Alush and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. Rephidim, there's no water for the people. You go back into the record, into Exodus, there's no water to drink. But what happens as a consequence? The people complain against Moses, against the Lord. Rephidim is a place of rebellion, of punishment, of stepping back, stepping away from what God wants. So you'll have places on that list that we know from our record in Scripture were places of God's provision, God's faithfulness. And we also know of places that would have just brought back memories of shame and embarrassment and failure for the people that are there. Now, I just want to say, again, three things about this list, just reflecting on that. Because I think this is remarkably like our own lives. As we look back over our own lives, there are going to be places and moments that stand out, like Elim in that first list, that first point. Places where you look back over what God's done in life, and you see points where God stepped in and where God changed things. And you saw God act in mercy and grace and power. And you can look back on moments like that and thank God for them and draw strength from them. And we should thank God for experiences like that, when God steps into life and does something that you just hadn't expected. And these kind of points in life stand out. Secondly, there are probably most of our life, which are just simply ordinary days. God provides for us and cares for us, and nothing spectacular particularly happens. There's nothing that happens out of the ordinary. You go to work, you do the work you do, and you come home again, and it's just like it was last week and the week before that. And there's a sense in which this list reminds us that those days are important to God too. You can easily feel as if life is just slipping past. You're ticking off another week on the calendar, and nothing new or particularly amazing is happening in life. But this list reminds us that God keeps a record. God told Moses, keep a record of everywhere you went. Even if nothing special happened there, write it down, record it, because God wants it on his list. I think it maybe just reminds that even on those days when nothing particularly important happens, it's just our quiet and steady and day-to-day faithfulness, even on the days that don't appear to matter much, do matter to God. Every day is marked out by God. Every day is watched over. And even if nothing spectacular happens, just ticking over from day to day and trying to stay faithful in just ordinary routine things, that is still important to God, because God marked those days out on his list here. And then thirdly, you look at the places that were places of great failure, and I'll read verse 14 again. And they set out from Alush and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. And you think, okay, that's fine, but we know from Exodus this was a place of failure. But where's the record of their mistakes in Exodus 33? Where's the detail about their rebellion? Where's the mention of all the sins of the previous? There's no mention of any of it. And you go through all the list in Exodus 33, and there's no mention of any of the failure of the people. It's as if God has done with that, dealt with that, forgiven, and left it in the past. God has no desire to throw these failures back in the faces of the next generation. And so this list does not record any of the failure that was there. Even though people must have heard those place names and thought, yeah, that was embarrassing, it doesn't mention it. When God has this list in Numbers, it doesn't record it there. And Moses reacted to the Reubenites and the Gadites in part based on the scars of his past experience. And Moses almost refers to and brings up their past. God has this list in chapter 33, and he does not bring up the past failures and past mistakes of the people. He treats this new generation with the grace and compassion that he would like him to treat us with. We don't escape the consequences of our failures any more than the people of Israel did, who spent many years in the wilderness because of failure and rebellion. But God has no desire to keep a record of our wrongs just to shame and embarrass us. So then in Hebrews 8 you get written this: for I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. And that is the same God we worship, who doesn't keep a record of failure and sin. You can just simply write, this is Rephidim, ran out of water there, it was hard, move on. And the failures that were there are no longer recorded. And it's the same God who has compassion on us, who forgives us and doesn't hold it against us, doesn't treat us based on the emotional wounds and scars that are in the past, but treats us with grace and love and compassion. So how is that possible, that God can do that? So one last section, it's from chapter 35. Chapter 34 describes the dividing of the land. You have the the tribe of Levi, who don't receive a specific portion of the land, but still need somewhere to live. And so they get 48 cities scattered throughout the land. However, some of these are going to be special cities. So Numbers 35, verse 6. The cities that you shall give to the Levites shall be the 6 cities of refuge, where you shall permit the manslayer to flee, and in addition to them you shall give 42 cities. All the cities that you shall give the Levites shall be 48 with their pasture lands. So there are going to be 48 cities for the Levites, 6 of which are going to be cities of refuge. And that is to say, when someone takes the life of another person, they have somewhere to go to escape the avenger. That is probably a member of the extended family who wants to take revenge, who wants to avenge the death of the person that has been killed. Now, verse 15 states this is the taking of the life of another without intent. So we're not talking about premeditated murder here. We're looking at more like manslaughter in our terms. Now, Leviticus 4 describes a series of offerings that you can present for unintentional sins, but there's no offering for the unintentional sin of killing somebody else. That is a class apart. So then this chapter offers 6 cities, which would be cities of refuge. If someone unintentionally kills somebody else, to escape revenge being taken on them, they can flee to one of these cities. There's a whole procedure described to determine help decide to what extent is this person innocent of murder, or was it actually murdered and they're claiming it wasn't. And if they've been found responsible for the accidental death of another, they can live and remain at the city of refuge. Now, before we explain any further, it's interesting to remember again the way the past shapes the present. Remember, right back in Genesis, the tribe of Levi, a person Levi himself, the son of Jacob, who was the forefather of the Levites. When his father Jacob, at the end of his life, offers his blessing to his sons, listen to what he says about Levi. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. All my glory be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So remember that the sin of Levi and Simeon in Genesis 34, when they to avenge a sin against their sister, they respond by slaughtering the inhabitants of the town of Shechem. And this is Levi, whose descendants now form the inhabitants of cities of refuge. So that is to say, had God done to Levi what is mandated now for someone who kills another, Levi would have been killed years back. Their forefather was guilty of murder, and now his descendants are going to be the ones who live in and administer the cities of refuge. His descendants are going to oversee trials of people who have been accused of manslaughter. And you would hope that maybe God does this in part so that he wants these people to remember the grace that their tribe has received, the grace shown by God in a sense to their forefather and their tribe. As you hear what the cases are and pass sentence on other people, remember that you've been shown grace. You wonder if that's maybe part of the logic. Why does God give the Levites these cities? Partly only because their forefather, Levi, was shown grace. Anyway, the people that have fled there and now arrive at these cities of refuge are not permanent residents. Verse 25, and the congregation shall rescue the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge to which he had fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with holy oil. And then verse 28, which is there, for he must remain in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to the land of his possession. So how long does this person stay in the city of refuge? Until the death of the high priest. That could be the week after he was found guilty of manslaughter. He only spends a week there. It could be 10 years. The time period is not important. What is important is this. One person has taken the life of another, and that requires a death to atone for a death. There is no money payment possible. You cannot pay a fine or a ransom to escape from the consequence. There is no specific sacrifice to offer. There's no period of time to wait for this to work itself out. The only thing that will satisfy is the life of another person. However, it does not require the ritual killing of somebody else to atone for that death, the Lord will accept the natural death of the high priest in place of the one who killed another. That someone has killed somebody else, even accidentally, and someone has to pay for that. And the person does not have to pay. They can flee to a city of refuge. And eventually, the natural death of the high priest will satisfy the demand for justice in the land. And then that person is free. They can go back to where they came from. They can go back to the land of their possession. And the death of the high priest, somehow, God sees that as atoning. Now, it doesn't require any kind of ritual killing. It just requires the natural death of the high priest. And we can all hopefully see where that's pointing. There is no power in the death of a purely human high priest. This all points to Christ, our great high priest. He took the sin of humanity on himself. And his sacrifice, as Jesus dies on the cross, that is what then enables God to look on us and not act in accordance with the things that we've done. How can God say, I will remember their sins no more? Because Jesus took the punishment for us. How can God look back over our life like he looks back over the history of Israel in chapter 33 and not pick out all the failures and mistakes and rebellions? Because Jesus took the punishment for failures and rebellion. And the reason God does not treat us as we deserve is because of Jesus. How is it possible that we can be guided by God's grace day by day, even on days that just seem average and random and ordinary? Because Jesus died for us, and we're now part of God's family. How can we be forgiven and set free to go home? Not to the same home we came from, but to go to an eternal home which Christ is preparing for us even now. In the same way that the high priest dies and they can go back to their home, Jesus is preparing a home for us even now. Why can we go there? Because Jesus died for us, our great high priest that gave himself for us. That this whole section is, in its context, pointing the people towards, this is the land you're going to inherit. This is what it's going to be like, living under the God who's there. And for us, we can look at that and think, actually, what's this telling us? This is what life is like, living as part of God's family through Jesus' sacrifice and being part of his family now.